It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM, AM 1160, and WCCSradio.com, and our conversation with Thomas W. Gilbert, the author of Death in the Strike Zone, The Mystery of America's First Baseball Hero, is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, voted best law firm and best personal injury lawyer 4 years in a row in the Best of Indiana County contest. You can visit them online at marcusandmack.com. Thomas Gilbert, good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to have you with us here today to talk about this book, because I'm guessing that not a single person out there, not a single person has ever heard of Jim Creighton.
No, that's part of that's a major part of the mystery about him, because there's no denying he's incredibly important and impactful, and not to mention a fascinating story. And how he got forgotten is, it's an interesting question. It's a tough one to answer.
Well, the era in which we're talking, or about which we're talking, is a part of this whole mystery, because there's not a lot statistically that we can look at as a typical baseball book. There's certainly no video footage of him, very few photographic evidences from his era. And the stories about him, his life, and his very sudden death are a great mystery that you managed to bring together all into one narrative in this game. And along the way, you teach us all about baseball in the 1860s. That's a pretty monumental task.
Well, thanks. It was a lot of work. And, the reason for the title, that sounds like a murder mystery, is I sort of thought of it as a cold case, because, the odds of finding new information about him are very low, although I found one new photograph and a couple other things. But we're talking about something that is getting old files out, blowing the dust off, and then looking at them in a different way. And it really paid off.
So
I found out, I did, I think, solve most of the mysteries about Creighton.
Introduce us to Jim Creighton. He died at the very tender age of, 21?
21. Yeah, so the first thing you have to understand about, we're talking about pre-professional baseball. Mm-hmm. So baseball has been around forever, and it was an amateur sport until 1871, when the first professional league is founded. So before 1871, historians call it the amateur era, where people played it the way people play amateur sports now. If you were playing for a softball team or playing golf for your country club or something, and people weren't supposed to be paid, and they weren't supposed to do it as careers. And what happened at the end of the amateur period was it caught fire and went national, became really competitive, and there was a lot riding on it, and, money walked in the door that was opened by that. And Creighton is part of that, because he was a great, great athlete. And he grew up in a terrible slum in Lower Manhattan called the 5 Points, which, if you've seen Gangs of New York, the film, that's where that's set. Mm-hmm. And we don't have too many details about how he ended up in Brooklyn playing for the Brooklyn Excelsiors, one of the best teams in baseball at that time. But he was definitely recruited in some form. And as far as I can tell, the first youth athlete ever recruited in American sports. And so he was an outstanding athlete, and we know this for various reasons. When he took up cricket, he immediately became great at it, and Americans weren't very good at that sport. So he gets recruited in New York City, brought to Brooklyn by this club called the Excelsiors, and in 1860, he's their everyday pitcher. And in those days, pitchers pitched every inning of every game, pretty much. Yeah. And the other thing is, they threw underhand. If you went to a game in 1860, you'd probably think you were looking at some weird variant of softball. Mm-hmm. They threw underhand, and they didn't throw very fast. And Creighton's big breakthrough was, even though he did throw underhand, he figured out how to throw very, very hard, much harder than anybody else had. And that was a mystery that historians have always been stumped by. What was he doing? He also made the ball curve. And nobody understood it when it happened, which is maybe not a huge shock. The first time you see a curveball, you don't know what it is. But immediately, people started wondering if he was cheating and accusing him of cheating, simply because he was so good. If you could imagine a pitcher now coming along and throwing 150 miles an hour, people would say, well, he's got to be doing something. That can't be legal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened to Creighton. And I argue in the book that he was not cheating. What he did was he made a conceptual breakthrough about pitching motions, and he also lifted weights and trained in a way that no one ever had before.
Well, one of the great things about the book is you actually give us a tutorial, even a photographic tutorial, on how it was that what the pitching motion looked like back in that day, which is entirely different. We can't even picture a softball player today with his underhand toss, whether it's fast pitch with the windmill or it's the lob it in on the slow pitch fields. That doesn't approximate it at all when you consider the way they threw it.
It's not like either one of those things.
Yeah, but you did find somebody who throws sort of in that way.
Well, weirdly enough, I stumbled upon a variant of softball, and maybe some of your listeners know about this. It's played in different parts of the country. A lot of it around Mid-Atlantic and New Jersey and Staten Island, but this is also played in the upper Midwest. It's called 10-man modified. And it was kind of a fascinating discovery for me because the pitching rules are almost the same as baseball in 1859 and 60 when Creighton came up. And the whole purpose of them is to prevent you from snapping your wrist or straightening your elbow, which is what you do when you throw, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you're throwing underhand now, you're whipping the ball. But in those days, you had to pitch like pitching horseshoes. You had to pitch with a straight arm. And the big question is, how did Creighton throw so hard doing that? And this is the question that I answer in the book. But it's a kind of technical breakthrough, and I tried to explain it the best I can so that people can understand it. But hopefully they can. And the accusations that he was cheating came 10 years after he died, which I think is a clue that they were wrong.
Yeah.
They just didn't understand what he was doing.
They were baffled.
Yeah.
But the book is called Death in the Strike Zone, and deliberately so, because the mystery of Jim Creighton also involves his demise, and at such a very, very young age. And you get into this mystery, and you actually, from my standpoint, you solve what it is that killed Jim Creighton, and it's not as nefarious as some people might think.
Well, the real tragedy is baseball, as we see it today, it chews up pitchers, right? Mm-hmm. It destroys. It's bad for your body. Pitchers get new ulnar ligaments put in regularly like clockwork, and there's a problem with pitching, which is that if you're good at it, you'll get overworked, and if you get overworked, you end up on a surgeon's table. Well, nobody knew anything about that in Creighton's time, and the way he pitched involved a lot more effort and a lot more physical strain than the conventional method before him, and I explain this. So he's on a team, the Excelsiors, who are playing. We're not even sure how many games because they only counted match games against other clubs, but he's carrying a really big workload. I approximated it to something like 500 innings today. Mm-hmm. And they don't know, this is unexplored territory, the way he's pitching and how much his body can take. And anyway, to make a long story short, he destroyed his health pitching, being overworked. And I don't say that the people that ran the Excelsiors knew what they were doing. I think they knew they were overworking him, and they knew that his health was declining. They didn't know that they were ultimately going to kill him because he had a inguinal hernia, and I explain this in the book. And if you went to a doctor today, this wouldn't be life-threatening, but the doctor would tell you to be careful lifting weights and anything involving extreme physical stress and twisting, mm-hmm. which is what his motion was about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the national shock when he died is really something.
Yeah. He helps us he helps baseball to become the sport that it is even today. And without him, we're not talking about baseball the way that we do. But you introduced us to some other great characters, and included among them is another guy who baseball basically ruined his health too. Joe Leggett, the catcher, is a fascinating guy for me through the course of your book.
No, he is. I've always been fascinated by him. And, your listeners should remember when they hear about this era, no catcher's equipment.
Yeah.
So, if a guy's throwing 50, 60 miles an hour, as they were in the 1850s, it's difficult enough. And the ability of the catcher to stop a ball was decisive in games. You can read box scores where there's 20 passed balls and nobody's raising an eyebrow. So the pitcher's the catcher's kind of a backstop, and he has no mask, no shin guards, no glove, nothing. And Creighton comes along throwing, I figured the equivalent from 45 feet is around Aroldis Chapman velocity. Mm-hmm. Imagine trying to catch that with your bare hands.
Yeah.
And he ends up 1 year doing that every day in 1860 really messes him up physically. He ends up with a bad shoulder and broken fingers and a broken leg even. But a fascinating person because he on the field was a hero. Off the field, not such a great guy.
No kidding. Joe Leggett, and there's real doubts as to whether or not he was throwing games and making his own little money on the side.
I kind of stumbled across that. I wasn't looking for corruption, but when I learned more about Leggett, it suddenly cast things like the 1860 championship game in a new light.
Yeah, absolutely. The book is fascinating as well from the historical standpoint because while all of this is going on, especially the early life of Jim Creighton, we have this little thing called the Civil War happening in America. And guys are going off and fighting in the war. Jim Creighton avoided that. And he still met his demise at a very young age, like a lot of people of his age range would have in the Civil War. And you weave all of that in. You got to tell me why you decided to write this book and how it was that you decided to actually make this into one cohesive story with everything that is happening at that time. And it's not a great big book. You've done a wonderful job.
Oh, well, thank you. For me, I'm just a curious person, and I want to know where from and why they happened. And books. All the books I've ever written start with questions that are not leaving me alone. And I've been spending most of the last 20 or 30 years researching early baseball, and I realized one day how little we knew for sure about Creighton, and yet his impact is massive. One of the points we haven't talked about is that he's the reason why we have a strike zone. It's hard to imagine having more of an impact on baseball than that. Mm-hmm. I compare him to Babe Ruth, and he dwarfs the impact of Babe Ruth, which sounds silly because Babe Ruth is so famous, but Creighton's pitching was so good that nobody swung. And you were kind of on your honor to swing at good pitches, and people said, well, I can't hit that, so I'm not going to swing at it, which set in motion, a process that gave us the strike zone. The strike zone is baseball. It's what we're looking at on TV. It's hard to exaggerate how important that is. And then Creighton's stardom, as you mentioned, it helped sell the game, which way back when was only played in New York until about the mid-1850s. It sold it to the whole country. And the Excelsiors traveled all around the country showcasing it with Creighton as a star attraction. And ultimately, the first baseball card is a picture of him.
Yeah. It's just a great read, and folks who want to know about baseball, and here we are starting a new season with the automated strike zone. So thanks, Jim Creighton.
It does put it in an interesting light.
Yeah. The book is Death in the Strike Zone, Thomas W. Gilbert. Hey, thanks for spending some time with us today. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the kind words.
Where do people learn more about you and about your books?
HowBaseballHappened as one word.com is my website. So just spell out HowBaseballHappened with no spaces.com, and they can find out more about me and my other books.
Beautiful. Appreciate it. Have a great day today.
Okay, you too. Thanks.